Hello and welcome back to the 2023 CCSE Research Conference, Politics, Communication, and Polarization, hosted by the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement and the Brian Lamb School of Communication at Purdue University. I'm Andrea Langrish, Managing Director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. Before we get started, please be sure you have your camera turned on so our speakers can see you and have your microphone on mute. You will use the raise hand function during the Q&A portion of the session. Okay, let's get started. Moderating our first panel is Diana Zulli, Assistant Professor of Political Communication at Purdue University. And I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Bryce Dietrich for the introduction. Dr. Dietrich?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Dr. Zulli's research, Diana Zulli, will be moderating our first panel. Her research focuses on the interaction of communication theory, digital technology, and political rhetoric. She serves on the advisory committee for the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement and is a faculty instructor for the 2024 Boiler Goes to DC Maymester program. Diana is interested in how communication theories function in and are affected by the rapidly changing digital communication environment, how news media shapes political discourse, and how digital technology affects social and political processes. Her work has been published in a number of communication journals, including Communication Theory, New Media and Society, Critical Studies in Media Communication, Politics and Gender, Social Media and Society, and the International Journal of Communication, among others. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Diana Zulli. Thank you.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for joining our first panel of the conference. The panel is titled Polarizing Rhetoric, Who is Laughing Now? I will give a little description of the panel, introduce the speakers, and then we'll let them take the floor. But this panel explores political polarization in American politics from two unique perspectives: language used in congressional policy and comedy speeches from the White House Correspondents' Dinner. By evaluating the polarization of party and income, the first paper will analyze how members of the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate use rhetoric to construct the middle class narrative and to further advance their policy preferences. This analysis will delve into identities, values, issues, and narratives to understand the ideological divisions within discussions of socioeconomic inequality that can lead to deepening political polarization. The second paper investigates the role of political humor in polarization, using comedic speeches from the White House Correspondents' Dinner and analyzing the advantages or disadvantages of using humor as a tool for political commentary. By employing a multimodal approach that includes elements like gestures, postures, speech, and attention patterns, this paper will explore how comedic speeches either worsens or can lessen political polarization. Together, these two perspectives will provide a distinctive and thoughtful understanding of polarization in American politics, from serious political discussions and discourse to lighthearted world of political humor. And so with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Dakota Park-Ozee. I will say before I introduce her that Dakota and I know each other from our graduate days at the University of Utah, so I'm thrilled to be introducing her as our first speaker of the conference. And her paper is titled Polarization of Party and Income, Rhetorical Constructions of the Middle Class During the 117th Congress. Dr. Park-Ozee is a first-year assistant professor of political communication in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Denver. She teaches public speaking, political communication, quantitative methods, and is developing a community-engaged course in campaigns. Her research focuses on discursive hierarchies in U.S. political life, particularly tied to class and gender. She conducts university service on workload equity and serves NCA in both the Political Communication Division and the Women's Caucus. And so with that, please help me welcome our first speaker, Dr. Park-Ozee.
Thank you. And I would just like to echo, I was just as excited when I saw that Diana would be introducing me, because we go back. So I will do a nice little screen share here. Cool. So as Diana said, the paper is titled Polarization of Party and Income, Rhetorical Constructions of Middle Class During the 117th Congress. And the basic idea here is that there's a lot of scholarly work on polarization that focuses on political polarization among the electorate, candidates, office holders, but that there's also increasing economic polarization plaguing the nation. For example, middle income households, which are calculated as those between 50 and 150% of the median income, shrank from 58% of the nation to 48% in the last 50 years. And this phenomenon is tied to policy, which is increasingly influenced by that same partisan polarization. So the economic and political centers are both shrinking in the United States, and research finds that these trends go together in part because of partisan ideologies related to economic class. And so I probe the intersection from a communicative lens by assessing how these two increasingly polarized ideological camps talk about that shrinking economic middle, particularly when debating US policy. So how do members of the United States Congress rhetorically construct the increasingly precarious middle class to advance policy preferences? And again, this is in a context where that middle class is shrinking, but they're overestimated and consistently underexplicated. So the United States possesses this uncanny inflated belief in its own middle class as a key part of the national social and economic image is this fantasy that it's a, quote, middle class society without unjustifiable extremes of wealth and poverty. And that's from Dana Cloud in 2002. And that the middle class is in many ways a rhetorical mechanism that hides these extremes. And so the obfuscation and justification of class inequality creates this culture where there's routine overestimations of the percentage of people in the middle class. And this has been true since at least the 90s. And this overestimation persists. So the Pew Research Center did a study in 2015, and respondents, 1% of people described themselves as upper class, 10% of people described themselves as lower class, which left 89% describing themselves as being part of the middle class, which is statistically improbable that 89% would be in the middle, especially again when that number based on actual income is down to 48%. So the rhetorical and social construction of the middle class is desirable, but also like ubiquitous and vague, and it creates a cultural context where more people believe they belong to the middle class than is actually possible. But this lack of clarity, I argue, is also useful politically. So the lack of a specific popular definition to the middle class makes them difficult to identify, which then makes them more rhetorically useful for politicians advancing policy. So how do you define something that is intentionally vague? So I borrow from argumentation scholars here. So Walton and McCogno talk about identity via association, which is that when identity groups are not clearly explicated or defined, we can often infer who has membership in that group or is part of that group based on what other groups they might be associated with. There's also Zarefsky talks about persuasive definitions that use values. So persuasive definitions of the middle class may associate them with particular values that are either good or bad, probably good since they're a lauded group. And then Zillman, when talking about exemplification, talks about the ways narrative is useful in defining various groups. So key narratives can exemplify particular trends or patterns or groups, or in this case, I'm using it to exemplify policy. So I combine quantitative and qualitative methods to do this. First, using C-SPAN, obviously, I downloaded every mention of the middle class during the 117th Congress. So from January 3rd, 2021 through January of 2023. And then removed anything that wasn't official congressional business. So C-SPAN also has book reviews and interviews and press releases and things like that, but I only kept things that were statements on the floor of the House or Senate or committee hearings or meetings or things like that. So official congressional business. And that left 817 speeches, questions, statements that invoked the middle class across that 2-year period. So I then first do that quantitative comparison of those who invoke the middle class versus Congress as a whole, because the Congressional Research Service actually keeps pretty good data on the demographic composition of Congress. And then a thematic analysis that looks at the identities, values, and issues tied to common narratives about the middle class made by the 117th Congress. So the first thing I looked at demographically was the average age and tenure of those invoking the middle class. So it probably won't be surprising to anyone here that Congress as a whole, both House and Senate, tend to be older than the average population of the United States. I think the median age in 2023 in the United States was just under 40. The average age in the House and the Senate were both over 60. But you can see that those talking about the middle class tend to skew even older and to have been in Congress longer than those who did not. So the average age of the 117th Congress in the House was 58, but those talking about the middle class, it was 60. And for the Senate, it was about 64. And for those discussing the middle class, it was 67. And the same thing for tenure. So those discussing the middle class in Congress tended to have at least 3 years, though in the Senate, it's closer to 6 years longer of a tenure in the body than those that were not talking about the middle class. So there's a seniority and an age skew happening there. There are also skews relative to both partisanship and gender identity. So Democrats, unsurprisingly, were talking about the middle class more often than their Republican counterparts and more than their percentage of both congressional bodies. This isn't really a significant difference in the Senate, but takes a little bit of a difference in the House. But more importantly on this slide is that and this time it's in the House where there's not really much of a difference. There's not much difference in gender in the House, but in the Senate, the disparity in gender is pretty stark. So there were 24 women in the Senate in the 117th Congress, which makes them 24% of the Senate. The math on that one is easy, and we appreciate that. But they only were part of 10% of the invocations of the middle class. So women in the Senate in particular were talking far less about this particular group than their male counterparts were in the 117th Congress. And then the gender disparities sort of lead into these various racial disparities. And it essentially sums up as both Black, Latino, Hispanic, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Indigenous or Native American representatives all talked about the middle class less than their proportion of the body. This is particularly stark, you'll notice, for Latino or Hispanic folks. So it's about, they talk about half of their proportion in the House and about a fifth as much in the Senate. And that's because the invocations in the middle class are disproportionately white in both chambers. So it's about a 6% gap in the House and about 7% in the Senate, which means that those talking about the middle class in the 117th Congress tend to have been there longer, be older, be more masculine, democratic, and whiter. And I think that that shows up in the qualitative themes. So the first theme is looking at identities, and the overwhelming identity, and this was bipartisan agreement, which we don't have very often, was that the middle class was identified in terms of families. So both parties, the family is the foundational unit of the middle class. So families are the backbone of the middle class. They're who compose the middle class. It's middle class families, families in the middle class. Like that is the central unit being used. But after foregrounding the middle class families, partisans do begin to diverge in their identifications. And that's because the GOP tended to be more likely to, as the secondary theme, because families were the most prominent for both, to talk about the middle class as American. So the American middle class was a key sort of identifier for Republicans talking about the middle class in the 117th Congress, in part to distinguish them from the middle class of other places, but also to emphasize nationality and nationalism, particularly tied to certain policies they discussed, which I'll get to in a couple of slides. And then Democrats were more likely to talk about the middle class in terms of labor. So middle class workers, workers in the middle class, working middle class families, things like that. So the labor was foregrounded for Democrats. So not a national identity, but rather an economic identity or the position that these folks serve within the broader economy or sort of political milieu. Is that to Democrats, they are workers. That's who the middle class is, and that's what they do, and that's sort of part of where their value comes from. And those values, right, are far more explicit for the Democrats than for the Republicans. So Democrats consistently refer to the middle class as the backbone of the nation. So they're valued for their strength in supporting the body politic through the center, right? So the metaphor of a backbone, very literal there. But they also talk about hard work a lot, which ties to that identity of being laborers. And so the value of the middle class is that central strength. And what the middle class is said to value is hard work. And the Democrats purport that they also value hard work and thus will reward hard work over wealth. The irony there, though, is that the reward for the hard work that the Democrats are proposing is itself wealth. So they're rewarding work instead of wealth, but they're rewarding work with wealth. If I can fit more W words in there, I would. But they want to do this in a way that is equal opportunity. So they want everyone to have, quote, a fair shot or a fair shake, and to make richer people pay their fair share. So this idea of fairness and equal opportunity, which is kind of contradictory to the idea of wealth accumulation in capitalist society. Republicans, on the other hand, are really unclear about values. So they make some references to hard work or to wealth or prosperity. There's some references to like independence, both energy independence of the economy, because this will help the middle class, but also the middle class being independent from the welfare state or government help. But they're not spending as much time talking about values as they are about policy issues. And so Democrats, very party line, unsurprising issue focus, which is not surprising because during the 117th Congress, they've got a Democratic president, Democratic House, Democratic Senate. Like they're going to be focused on passing their policy. So they talk a lot about Build Back Better, the Inflation Reduction Act, infrastructure, child tax credits, unions, party line economic issues, all of which, right, they talk about will help the middle class. The child tax credit is, quote, the largest middle class tax cut in American history, right? The Build Back Better Act will rebuild the middle class, right? So all of these things are targeted at the middle class in their articulations of policy. And Republicans do these things too, but with a little bit more of a numerical focus. So they like to report what the percentage of inflation is. Like if you calculate for inflation, it's basically this much of a tax on middle class wages. Gas prices are up by this percentage, which is harming the middle class. So they have a more numerical focus. But where Republicans sort of tie in this American identity is that there's a really large focus when discussing the middle class among Republicans on immigration. So the contrast of they're explicating pretty consistently that immigration is about whether or not immigration policy should be about whether or not it's good for the middle class, and that democratic immigration policy, so asylum or refugees or letting people cross the border, all of this is bad for the middle class. And that's their key policy focus more than anything else. And so this creates competing narratives about the middle class and what they are. So the Democrats and Republicans both acknowledge there's been shrinkage, but the Democrats make it seem sort of natural, the erosion of the middle class, and then use building metaphors. So we're going to build the middle class. We're going to create a ladder to the middle class to promote optimism through policy. So this policy will serve as a ladder to the middle class that people can climb to get there. Whereas Republicans, in fact, use a lot of really violent rhetoric in discussing the middle class. So they're under attack, they're under assault, they're being crushed or pummeled. Like essentially the economy is punching the middle class in the face, according to the Republicans. They're being hammered. And so they also acknowledge the shrinkage, but it's from the violence of bad policy to them. And this creates for me sort of three key takeaways. The first is that there's generational exclusion. So this focus on the family in many ways excludes the largest generation in American politics right now, which is the millennials, because every study shows that millennials are getting married later and less often, having children later and less often, buying homes later and less often. And those are the key measures of sort of establishing a household in most surveys. And millennials are doing this less and less and later. So if you're talking about middle class families, in many ways, that excludes a large portion of the largest voting bloc in the United States from your discussion of the middle class, which only exemplifies why that's happening, because most of the reasons millennials put those things off is because of a lack of access to things like the middle class. And then this idea of building to extract. So both parties want to build the middle class, want it to be bigger, want it to be stronger. But in both cases, it's largely not for the service of the individuals themselves. It's not that it's necessarily good for this specific person to enter the middle class, good for them. It's that the expansion of the middle class is good for the nation because we can extract more economic value and wealth as a country from the growth of the middle class. So it's not for individual benefit, it's for sort of this extractive purpose. And then this contrast of violent and hopeful narratives makes it so that both parties can use the middle class to say that they're either being helped or hurt by policies, which means that constituents can see themselves in either light, as either being helped or hurt by policies, which expands even further this ambiguity of the middle class, where anyone can see themselves that way, and anyone can then use their perspective as the middle class to adhere to specific policies. So they're really capitalizing on this ambiguity to advance policy. And that's what I've got. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dakota. Please help me give her a round of applause for the presentation, and I will open it up for Q&A. We have about 9 minutes for a Q&A before we transition to the next paper. So what questions do we have for our speaker? Yep, go ahead, Bryce.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. So my question is related to what you observed on C-SPAN. My sense from watching a lot of floor speeches is that when it comes to things like issue framing, that there's kind of some ringleaders that really kind of have to set the tone for these discussions, and that the parties tend to lean into these individuals to kind of keep the frame fresh, keep the frame moving forward, circulate the frame in and outside of Congress. And so I'm curious, when it comes to middle class framing with respect to Democrats and Republicans, who are kind of the key leaders when trying to frame this issue on C-SPAN?
Yeah, absolutely. So the people that had the most sort of uses in the middle class, for the Democrats, it was Bernie Sanders and Sherrod Brown, right? There's some Nancy Pelosi in there too, but Bernie and Sherrod Brown just all over the place. And then for Republicans, it was, weirdly enough, Kevin Brady giving like hour-long speeches, and then also Mitch McConnell doing a lot of the work on the Senate side.
Dakota, I have a question, because I know you do work in this space. I know I've heard you talk about some of these topics before. And so I was kind of just wondering, and you may not have an answer to this question, but what your sense would be of some of these themes of like issues, values, and identities, whether or not you think some of this framing and rhetoric would be consistent in like a campaign setting between Democrats and Republicans, because again, the violent versus hopeful rhetoric, you know, we know campaign communication changes some of that framing. Do you have a sense of if it would be similar, if it would be different, or what we might expect in that context?
Yeah, so I think that, yeah, that dynamic definitely mirrors what we might see in a campaign for like the incumbent versus the challenger, with the Democrats sort of taking the incumbency here because they're the party in power and the Republicans representing the challenger. But I think that we also are getting more in campaigns these days, specific references to identity groups beyond the middle class. So like thinking of even Scacco and Co.'s work on the ubiquitous presidency, like the pluralism that they find in lots of campaign contexts is simply not in this data set. And I imagine, at least for Democrats, that pluralism is likely going to be more prominent on the campaign trail, because there's only, I think like 3 or 4 mentions out of over 800 of any sort of racial group, or making it specific to like a gender group, or I think there's like 5 or 6 references to farmers as the only like specific kinds of workers. And so I think you probably would get more of those specific group call outs in a campaign context.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not in this literature, but I could see how, yeah, that makes sense with what I know too. Yeah. Other questions?
I'd like to ask a question. I may have missed this, but someone came into my office for a minute. But I wanted to know if you had any undertones of urban versus rural. I was reminded of a Tom Colburn speech a few years ago where he called himself a flatlander, and then he described himself as actually working a day in his life, and giving this insinuation that these rural people are the working class people, and then urban, they're just full of people who are not working. And I wanted to know if you got any at least undertones, indirect references to find some division in this middle class messaging on urban versus rural divide.
Yeah, so oddly enough, no, but I think that's because the middle class is so tied to this American dream sort of homogenous narrative that's like white picket fence, heterosexual marriage, 2.5 kids, like suburban sort of ideal, that it sits outside of that divide. This is now where I'm speculating. I imagine that if you did the same sort of search, but instead of with middle class, with working class or blue collar, that then you would find more of the urban rural divide when you're thinking in terms of blue collar workers instead of the middle class.
Any other questions?
Actually, I have one, Dr. Zuley.
Please.
So when you were looking for your information in the C-SPAN video library, how did you determine the types of videos that you would find to be the most useful in your research?
Yeah, that's a great question because the C-SPAN library has so much. So I wanted to, in fact, separate, in reference to Diana's question, to separate the business of governance from the business of campaigning. And so I wanted to look specifically at those. They're thinking of everything as potentially being seen by the public and sound bites and things, but those things that aren't exclusively for that purpose. So thinking press conferences and interviews and appearances on like talk shows as being really more public facing, sort of geared at the permanent campaign, versus those things happening in Senate hearings on the floor, while they obviously are going to have tinges of that, being more directly about governance and wanting to focus on that context as closely as possible.
Probably have time for one more question. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, please help me thank Dr. Park-Ozee for that presentation. And I'm happy to introduce our next speaker. And so I believe, Andrea, I'll hand you over. There we go. Yes. All right, so our second paper comes to us from an impressive list of authors. I'm going to read every single one, but it's an impressive list. Our presenting author is Alistair Windsor. I'll read his bio in a second, but this paper is also authored by Dr. Leah Windsor, who's an associate professor of applied linguistics in the Institute for Intelligent Systems in the Department of English at the University of Memphis. We have Alexander Murphy, who's a master's candidate in applied linguistics, also from the University of Memphis. Christian Cronstead, who's a fellow at Merrimack College. Deborah Tollefson, who's the vice provost and dean of the graduate school, University of Memphis. Egemen Churuk, who's a Ph.D. candidate in applied linguistics, University of Memphis. Miriam van Mersingen, who's the assistant professor from a School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at the University of Memphis. Nicholas Simon, associate professor, Department of Psychology, University of Memphis. And Sean Gallagher, Lillian and Maury Moss, professor of philosophy, University of Memphis. Now, the speech is titled Humor and Polarization in White House Correspondence' dinner comedy speeches. And our presenting author again is Alistair Windsor. Dr. Windsor is an associate professor in the Department of Mathematical Sciences and is the director for the Institute for Intelligent Systems at the University of Memphis. He serves as a co-PI on an NSF-funded project, Language Across Cultures, the Communication Styles of World Leaders. And his current interests are in large language models, data sciences, and STEM education. He earned his Ph.D. in mathematics at Pennsylvania State University. Please help me welcome Alistair Windsor.
Thank you all for having me. I'll share my screen. Okay, with luck, you can see the same long list of authors that you were just read. I'm going to be talking about work in progress. So not all of these people have signed off on this, and I'm jumping in here at the last minute because Leah was summoned to an emergency meeting with our university president. Okay. So indeed, we're going to be talking about multimodal analysis of humor and polarization in White House correspondents' dinner comedy speeches. So we're using a philosophical framework here of embodied cognition. To move pictures so I can see. So human beings are not computers. We don't think like computers. And the idea of embodied cognition is that our bodies are part of our cognitive process. There's feedback that goes both ways. And so if we're looking at how people think, then we can get a lot of information by looking at their gestures, about listening to their voices. And so that's this multimodal framework that we're looking at here. Okay. So the idea here is to look at the way world leaders in general for this project think. And this is a spin-off from our NSF-funded project. We're currently looking at gestures, eye blink activity, body language, tone of voice. We hope to, in the future, be looking at some EEG information for participants in the lab who are looking at political discourse. Galvanic skin response is another one that we use in the lab. The idea here is to capture a lot of information from the whole person as they either present or experience political discourse. So in the future, it'll be some lab studies with people in the lab looking at political discourse. Here we're looking at video, so obviously we can only get some information from the video. That's going to be voice, pitch of voice, loudness. We're going to be looking at eye blink data. We'll be looking at gesture classification. So I believe that this is the first of its kind, creating multimodal data sets in political science using some combination of computational linguistics and some of the sensor-based data that we're gathering from the lab. Okay. There's a note here which you will have gathered from our list of authors that this is an interdisciplinary project. We're looking at comedic speeches for various reasons. One is the content of the speech itself. The other one of which is looking at the response of the audience. So in this early work that I'm going to be presenting here, one of the things that we're looking at is understanding how things change with polarization in politics, what things happen during the speeches. So we're operationalizing polarization here using VDM data. We looked at some of the DW nominate data and approval ratings, but ultimately settled on using this. Here in the slide, you see measures of polarization on the left, and then on the right, we've got Luke scores, this is linguistic, a good inquiry through word count. So this is simply dictionary-based counts of words and of the speech that was given, and then looking at how these different categories correlate with polarization. You do see here some topics that some correlations you would expect. This comparisons are used more frequently when there's polarization. Interestingly, both certainty and tentative language are used more frequently when there's polarization. Us and I are used less frequently when there's more polarization. Informal, and therefore things get more formal as things get more polarized. We have less uses of the words in the here category, one of which is listening. So we talk less about listening as things get more polarized. And then there's prepositions and adjectives. We use adjectives more frequently as things get more polarized. So this is a sort of classic computational linguistics approach to looking at this and looking at correlations here. None of these correlations are super strong. This maze category here, this is disfluencies. And I think we got this from transcripts. So transcripts often vary in whether you get the disfluencies in the transcript or not. So that one's frequently questionable. One of the ideas that we're looking at here is trying to look at the difference between sort of production of multimodal signals and receiving of multimodal signals. So we have here two classic audio measures, frequency, often referred to fundamental frequency here, and intensity, which is loudness. We're not going to be talking about intensity at all during this talk. One of the reasons being that actually it varies considerably based on microphone distance from the speaker. Actually, the correspondents, they're very professional, and so we might be able to extract some signals here. But if you ever get this from live data, frequently what happens is that the speaker will hold the microphone at different distances, and so the variations in intensity that you capture have nothing to do with what the presenter is trying to communicate, but simply the fact that they're not very professional with the use of their microphone. The fundamental frequency, on the other hand, isn't dependent on distance to the microphone, and so that's something that we can look at for these speeches and capture here. One of the things that happens again and again in these and this multimodal stuff is that you have to look at how perception differs from production. So we tend to perceive pitch in terms of semitones, octave type thoughts, and this is not a linearly related to frequency. Same thing with intensity. Both of these measures tend to be logarithmic. We measure frequency in hertz, which is only then logarithmically related to the semitones, which we perceive as pitch. We measure intensity in decibels. Typically, decibels are already a logarithmic measure, and so that's actually what we perceive. So hence the lack of a conversion term here. So this is just a slide to point out that you always have to bear in mind not only what you're measuring, but how this is different than what's perceived by the receiver or the listener in this case, and make sure that you carry out the appropriate conversion or translation from the measure to the perceptual unit. This slide, I'll explain what we think is happening. So this is one of our measures, and this is just taken an average over all of the speakers, over all of the dinners. Here we have actually in the middle, we have a mean. At the top, we have a max. At the bottom, we have a min. And then we've just plotted a trajectory over a minute of these different frequencies. You can see here a significant dip towards the end. There are two things which are happening here, I think, which will tell you that this is just not a great graph to draw. The graph on the right gives us a little bit more information. And if you look at the graph on the right, what you'll see is that actually the curves are a lot flatter in both the mean and the max and min. And there is a dip towards the end in both the female curves, which are the three. I don't know if you can see my pointer. The three here, that these are mean, max, and min for female speakers, and then mean, max, and min for male speakers. Typically, male speakers have a deeper voice and therefore lower fundamental frequency. Towards the end of all of the speeches, there's a dip. One of the reasons for that is that actually part of our measures, part of the average measure here is measures that is noise that's picked up from the audience, and applause and laughter both tend to raise the fundamental frequency that's recorded by the microphone over that time period. And so as you get towards the end, as there are fewer jokes and they're just summarizing, you tend to get a dip. The big drop here is from the fact that women spoke much less in length, so their speeches were shorter than males on average. And so at the end here in the overall average, you suddenly have all of the female speakers who have much higher fundamental frequency drop out, and so that the smooth curve takes a big dip because we're only averaging over males at the end. But there is a dip towards the end of all of the speeches. So here we have two exemplars that we'll be talking about for the rest of the talk here. One is Al Franken in 1994, so that's during Clinton, and the other one is Michelle Wolf, who gave this famous address in 2018 during Trump. And what we've got here is this is the box plots plus the outliers for each of the minutes of their speech. What you can see here, well, one, Al Franken's voice is a lot deeper than Michelle Wolf's. And then there are all these outliers here in the Al Franken speech. And you see very few of them in the Michelle Wolf speech. These are so these are outliers for the box plot, and we'll come back to counting them in a different way in a second. Most of these outliers, if you look into them, they're applause. So it's easier to distinguish the applause, which is high, or the laughter, sorry, which is high from the speech of Al Franken. But if you recall Michelle Wolf's speech, while it may be that the laughter is harder to distinguish because she's higher, actually there just wasn't very much laughter in most of it. And so that's why we see far fewer outliers up here for Michelle Wolf, is that there's very few instances of laughter during her talk. Okay. So we also recall that the polarization during Clinton's era was significantly lower than the polarization during Trump 2018. So these outliers, we think that they're important, especially the outliers on the high side of fundamental frequency, because most of the time the outliers on the high side of fundamental frequency here are laughter. And so we have here a sort of proxy for how funny the speech is. And actually, Al Franken's speech is not a huge outlier in terms of how funny it was, in terms of the count of high frequency outliers. But you can see that Michelle Wolf's is definitely an outlier here. So these are z-scores based on overall counts of outliers. And I don't think that I don't think these were normalized for length. So I think these are just raw counts that we used when we produced this graph. So Michelle Wolf is over here. She's definitely an outlier on the downside, and actually Kimmel is an outlier on the upside for these high frequency counts. And we can see here that polarization is basically going almost linearly upwards during this period. It's not completely obvious the trend with the high frequency outliers, but at the beginning here, there's not a huge number of outliers going either way. And then, well, we get some here. There's a huge up one, and then there's lots of down low counts here. So as things get more and more polarized, we see fewer and fewer of these high frequency outliers, which we're interpreting as fewer and fewer rounds of laughter during the White House correspondent's speech. So this is all audio data. We're also looking at linguistic data. So these are looking at the transcripts and doing LDA on the transcripts. So topic modeling here of the transcripts. So I think these are 10 topics that we derived by looking at the transcripts for the White House correspondence speeches. These have been named by Leah in this case. So there are some top words, and then there's a sort of summary here. The one that you see to pay attention to actually is topic 2, generic introductions. That will be a constant throughout all of the speeches. But then there are some dangerous themes and some other topics which we'll see topping up. And we can see as we look that there are changes in these themes as you go across time. So again, at the moment, this is at the level of individual speech. So we haven't tried to break down at the moment, looking at how these themes change during a speech and how that correlates to speaker performance. But let's have a look at the themes. So this is we've got some missing data as well, but this is a example of how the topics change throughout the time that we have data for here. The big bar, the big fat part of this bar here all the way through is topic 2. That's just sort of generic speechifying, introductions, etc. But we can see that the topics that make up the beginning here are very different from topics that make up the end. Unsurprisingly, the purple one is the one that corresponds here. We should have labeled them with the themes, is the one that corresponds to Trump. I'm not sure I totally agree with this description of this in terms of Trump, but we can see here there's a whole bunch of these terms here, including Bernie, and these start popping up here post 2008. We start seeing these terms appear. But what you can get from this is that the topic breakdown of the speeches changes over time and changes quite dramatically. So dangerous themes is topic number 4. So this is the one that starts popping up here, and then here. It's popping up more and more actually as things are getting polarized. Well, more frequently as things get polarized. Not one that occurred at the beginning, although we are missing some data from the early years. We're also looking at gestures. Now, our process for gesture coding is not particularly fancy. So we are human coding all of our data at the moment. And we're producing a code book. There is some work on automated computer classification of gestures, but mostly it's based on people like me front facing the camera, and it tends to classify about 5 distinct gestures, and does really well if you're making really distinct gestures, but it's not so great if you're moving around, if your gestures are unusual. It's also not great if the person is side on to the camera, like as we see here with Al Franken. This is him apologizing to his wife for the joke that he just made. So he's saying, sorry, honey. So that's a shame gesture. Here we have Al Franken stuffing his face at a buffet on Air Force One. Down here on the left on the bottom, he's suggesting that we can control the budget by combining NASA with Medicare and shooting seniors into space. And then at the very end here, he's making a joke. This is actually post-joke. He's just made a joke about the Montana Freeman who started the 81 days standoff with the FBI. And so this is a self-soothing gesture that you see here, since he's just got away with that joke. And this was a sort of standard type of White House Correspondents' Dinner. It was sort of the mean level of funniness that we observed based on the outlier data. Here we have Michelle Wolf, who, as you recall, spoke in 2018 during the Trump era. She said, basically, you should have done more research before you asked me to do this, because there was a lot of controversy about the speech. So here we have different gestures from her. She doesn't make as many gestures as Al Franken. So at the beginning here, top gesture, she has just a I'm telling you about myself gesture, which you can't see me making because I'm too close to the camera. So she's just saying this, I'm talking about me. She does a lot of hand flat gestures during this talk. And this one here, she's curled her hand. That's an unusual gesture for her. We've got a pointing gesture that she's pointing at the audience. Robert Mueller making a joke there. And then at the end, she's doing an elbow poke gesture when she's talking about abortion. She's not super expressive during the talk in terms of gestures. So what do these mean? Well, it's hard to say. It really varies based on context. And so one of the things that we're doing is taking not only the gestures, but then the surrounding transcript and the audio thing, so that we can look at both the sort of prosodic features of the speech and the actual text that they're saying, and try and put the gestures in context. The pointing one is she's actually pointing at, I think, at Bob Mueller in the audience. So what these things mean really depends on context, which is part of the reason that we're looking at this whole embodied cognition framework from philosophy. So what can we say in conclusion? So multimodal analysis can help us understand dynamics of humor during times of high and low polarization. Comedic speeches reflect, possibly more so than many other things, polarization. We've looked at delivery and a little bit about we say audience perception. The audio in the files captures both applause and laughter, and so we see and hear more laughter during the less polarized times. And finally, we're looking at this all through this framework of embodied cognition, which is from philosophy, which situates the speaker and their whole body in an environment, including political climate, and looks at all of the motions, gestures, facial expressions, audio things as being some part and whole of the cognitive process of the speaker. Okay. So we've taken a data alignment process here. So we're busy trying to align data from our text, from our transcript data, with our audio data and with our video data. This is quite difficult to do for various reasons. But also you start to run into this, what's the scale of interest? So the people who look at audio data typically look at audio data in very short windows. But if you're trying to align this with speech, then you're looking at different scales. And so we're actually, at the moment, we're playing around with all the different ways of chopping things up into meaningful chunks, whether it be word or sentence or paragraph, and looking at where we can tie these different things together.
Dr. Winter, thank you so much for that presentation. I do want to give a few minutes for a Q&A, so I'd love to open it up to the audience before we have to move on. What questions do you have for Dr. Winter about this really interesting work? Any questions from the audience?
I can ask a quick question.
Great.
The correspondence dinner that involved Stephen Colbert, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, he did it in character. That was his Comedy Central character. So everything's sarcastic, or nearly everything's sarcastic. But it sounds like everything was automated with the coding and the data collection, but I didn't know if you needed to take any extra steps to understand his true intentions of speech for that particular one.
Well, the short answer is we haven't got that far yet. But yes, I mean, that's part of this. Yeah, understanding what the speaker's purpose was, what they were doing. If we look at that, probably it will affect the fundamental frequency data. But since at the moment we're doing most things based on sort of z-scores, so the speaker relative to their mean performance, I'm not sure it'll make that much difference. But yes, the data is very rich, and we're only at the very beginning of trying to analyze all of this.
Any other questions? Maybe one more. Go ahead, Diana. Thank you.
So you mentioned that overall the female videos and kind of speeches tended to be shorter than the, male speakers and things like that. Do you think that there's a reason, or is that kind of beyond the scope of what you were looking at?
I don't know. We haven't looked at that yet. I don't know. I don't know what the reason is, but yes, we can say that about on average they're about half as long, so it's quite noticeable. I mean, you may have some thoughts as to why the men go on and on and on and on, but I couldn't possibly comment.
Diana, you do work in gender. Do you have any thoughts? Not to put you on the spot.
I wasn't sure. I was just kind of thinking of it as far as like just kind of having that seat already made at the table for you. So feeling more comfortable to speak for longer. It kind of relates back to research I've done on TikTok with like there's an in-group and an out-group. So since men are already part of the in-group, potentially they just feel more comfortable to speak longer, take up more time, kind of man-spreading, but in a verbal sense.
Yeah, there's also, it's not an even distribution. So there is relatively little data on female speakers at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So I'm not sure, I didn't do any of the statistical tests, so I don't know actually whether that's even statistically significant. It's a big difference, so I suspect it is. But yeah, there aren't very many exemplars on the female side. And I'm not sure that, I mean, one of them includes Michelle Wolf, and I'm not sure that that's a typical speech for the White House Correspondents' Dinner either. So just in our data window, we don't have that many examples. And at least one of them is an outlier, and for lots of reasons.
All right, thank you so much. Please help me thank Dr. Windsor for that interesting presentation. And I will hand it back over to Andrea.